consacrée aujourd'hui à la guerre en Ukraine et plus précisément aux conséquences de cette guerre dans la Caraïbe. Alors, je remercie tous ceux qui ont répondu à notre invitation, tous ceux qui sont sur la chaîne YouTube, sur le Facebook les radios et les télévisions qui ont accepté d'enregistrer, de diffuser également notre webinaire. Je m'appelle Fred Reynaud, je suis responsable du CAGI, le Centre d'analyse géopolitique internationale, qui est une équipe de recherche, qui est le pôle Guadeloupe du laboratoire caribéen de sciences sociales. Je suis en compagnie de Julien Mérillon, excusez-moi, qui est président du Co.Re.Ca. Alors, vraisemblablement de Marie-Noëlle Bruno du programme Élan. Nous avons aussi avec nous notre jury étudiant, composé d'étudiants de la filière sciences politiques de l'université, d'étudiants en mobilité du programme Élan, qui viennent pour la plupart d'Haïti, des pays de la Caraïbe de l'Est, notamment de Sainte-Lucie, de la Dominique, de Saint-Kitts. Saint-Kitts qui est le pays d'origine de Jessica BYRON, notre invitée. Jessica BYRON est professeure de sciences politiques et directrice de l'Institut des relations internationales de l'Université des West-Indies. Et donc, Mme BYRON interviendra pendant une trentaine ou un peu plus de minutes sur le sujet donc la guerre russe en Ukraine, quels défis pour la Caraïbe. Elle le fera en anglais, mais je vous rassure également en français. Autre précision, l'intervention de Mme BYRON sera suivie de questions d'étudiants dans un premier temps. Ensuite, nous ouvrirons le débat aux internautes. Après ce premier échange, donc, on aura la possibilité de sélectionner des questions du Zoom, des questions du CAGI YouTube, mais également du Facebook Live. Alors voilà, donc je vais passer la parole sans transition à Mme Jessica BYRON. On va commencer peut-être par un partage d'écran.
Est-ce que vous m'entendez?
Très bien.
Oui, d'accord. Bon après-midi à tout le monde. Merci beaucoup, M. Reynaud. Je veux vous saluer tous et je vois des noms très connus, des gens que j'ai rencontrés ici beaucoup de fois. Mes salutations à M. Bangou, M. Tassius, et
merci,
je vois des collègues de mon plaisir. Mme Gordon de Trinidad. Hi Lisa. Et je voulais vous remercier tous pour m'avoir invité. Il est toujours un plaisir d'être ici avec le CAGI et en plus d'être ici en Guadeloupe. Ça fait 2 ans que je n'ai pas visité et c'est vraiment un plaisir de vous rejoindre. Alors, j'espère qu'on va passer une bonne soirée en discutant un peu sur la crise, l'invasion, la guerre en Ukraine et les implications pour la Caraïbe. Merci beaucoup pour passer un peu de temps avec nous cet après-midi. Alors, je vais partager l'écran et on y va. Oui. Now, I'm going to speak in English. Usually, I don't speak very quickly, so I hope you can understand. But if there is anything that you wish me to clarify afterwards, I'll be happy to. And you will see that some of the slides have sous-titres, sont sous-titrés en français. But I'm afraid at some point during the preparation, I ran out of time and I ran out of patience. So I did not finish that exercise. So, toutes mes excuses, mais quand même, je crois que vous allez bien comprendre ce que je veux dire. So the topic is Russia's war on Ukraine, implications for the Caribbean. Ça passe pas. Je sais pas pourquoi, mais ça bouge pas. Peut-être je vais commencer à let me stop sharing. Et je vais commencer de nouveau pour voir what am I doing wrong? Sticking. Normalement, ça marche comme ça. Sorry about this. We're trying to solve a technical problem. We're not quite sure.
Je suggère que James prenne le relais. Je suggère que
Très bien.
Okay, so you will
Yeah,
share.
I have a copy of your PowerPoint on my desktop.
Right.
Just in case.
Okay. So should I stop sharing?
Yeah, stop sharing. I'm gonna start sharing right afterwards.
Thank you. And then I'll tell you when to change.
Yeah.
Tell you when to change, right? Great. Thank you very much.
So, so this should be the one.
Yeah. Let's go to the next. This is the title slide. Au-Prochain. Okay. Now this slide simply tells you what's going to happen over the next half hour, 40 minutes. So I'm just going to make a few remarks about la géopolitique internationale of this war. And after that, we will go to perspectives from the Caribbean and implications for the countries in the Caribbean. And there's a very short conclusion because what's really important are your questions and the discussion that we'll have. Next slide, please. I included this slide simply to show that although we are really very far away from Ukraine, from the area of Europe where all these terrible events are happening. But because we live in such a globalized and such a connected world now, such an interdependent world, what is happening in Ukraine has implications for every other part of the globe. So let us go to the next slide. Let's see. Now I'm going to start by referring to an article that was written by 3 of my colleagues at the Institute of International Relations. I think it's an article that just came out by Jacqueline LaGuardia, Anita Montut, and Dave Siratan. And it's really a commentary on what is happening in Ukraine and what are the implications globally and in the Caribbean. So I'm just going to summarize some of the main points because I think that they did an admirable summary. So the world order, this is not simply a confrontation between Ukraine and Russia. It is part of a larger picture, which is that we are living through a major power transition in the world order. And there is a clear risk of conflicts proliferating. It might be that we are living through a violent transition to an eventual new world order, although it's very unclear what the shape of that order will be. But what we do know is that over the last few years, and this tendency heightened during 2021, there were tensions in the Western Alliance, tensions within NATO, and between the European Union and the United States. The United States, it was felt, was not as close to its allies as it was once upon a time. It was also more and more obvious that Russia was very dissatisfied with its place in the world and its place in its region, and that Russia felt threatened and obviously wishes to reimpose by force the spheres of influence that it had, that were agreed on in the 1940s and that were re-engineered between 1988 and 1991. Next slide, please. So we no longer live in a bipolar world. We live in a multipolar space. There are many actors and many arenas. And each of these actors has cross-cutting interests. Everybody is trying to protect and to advance their own priorities. So it's no longer a situation where the West can impose or the East can impose. Both the West and the East have had limited success in recent years in convincing other actors. Probably that is what has brought us to this point. And now, in this current crisis, it is obvious that large powers and middle powers have their own interests and their own positions concerning this crisis. Globalization and interdependence have also demonstrated that you cannot simply punish an aggressor. In punishing that aggressor, because all global economies are so intertwined, it will also mean high costs for those imposing sanctions and for the rest of the world. So a conflict such as this one is much more complex than previously. Next slide. The conflict, as my colleagues pointed out in their article, also highlights the role of the BRICS. The BRICS stands, of course, for Brazil, India, China, South Africa. And these emerging powers, in fact, it has not highlighted the BRICS in a very good light, because the BRICS have not shown much inclination, not much will to really try to stop the conflict. While they have expressed regret or they have been disturbed at the war, while they have called for negotiations, they have not fully supported Western positions. They have tended to prioritize their own interests. China does not support economic sanctions. Some BRICS have their own territorial disputes or their own international alignments to consider. So the BRICS have certainly not been a very stabilizing force in this conflict. Next slide, please. Yeah, so let us go to the question of global geopolitics. I think in terms of legal norms, it is quite clear that Russia's invasion is a violation of Ukraine's territorial integrity and a violation of many international legal principles. In fact, every day we are witnessing the commission of international war crimes, which hopefully one day will have to be reckoned, when somebody will have to have a reckoning. And the conflict has also unleashed an enormous humanitarian disaster with long-lasting implications, particularly for Europe. It also takes place in the context of the struggle to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. And there are many other social conflicts, wars, and challenges of rising poverty to destabilize the world at this point. We had hoped that the global economy was slowly but surely being rebooted, but growth targets are being revised abruptly downwards, and scenarios for social conflicts are looming larger and larger. Next slide, please. So let us go now to looking at the Caribbean and the implications for actors in the Caribbean and the responses of actors in the Caribbean. I'm going to start with a few of the multilateral groupings: CARICOM, CELAC, and the Organization of American States. CARICOM has issued two statements concerning the Russian-Ukraine war, one in February and the other in March. CARICOM has roundly condemned the Russian invasion, called for an immediate withdrawal of the military presence in Ukraine, and for a halt to all further actions. CARICOM has condemned this violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and its territorial integrity. In fact, CARICOM has emphasized that our own community, our own Caribbean community, is built on principles of respect for sovereignty, respect for territorial integrity, non-interference in the domestic affairs of countries, the prohibition of the use of force or the threat of force, and a peaceful resolution of disputes. CARICOM is made up of a number of very small states, and obviously these are principles that favor the prospering of small states in the global community. The Organization of American States also passed a resolution condemning Russia's actions towards Ukraine. Next slide, please. I'm not sure where it is. There is another slide. I'm sure I'll come back to it at some point. There is also a statement from CELAC, which I had wanted to highlight, but I can always do that at some stage. I think that it may be in Fred, it may be in the other version. Okay. However, I can just recall for you what CELAC, which is the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, what CELAC said and did. CELAC is presently, the pro tempore chair is Argentina. CELAC had a meeting late in February with the heads of other regional organizations, with the head of CARICOM, the chair of CARICOM, the chair of the Central American Integration Movement, with the Secretary General of the United Nations, and with the Secretary General of CARICOM, at which they made particular mention, the CELAC chair made particular mention of not only to condemn the conflict in Ukraine and the aggressive actions of Russia, but to express his pride in the tradition of peaceful resolution of conflict in the Americas. His pride in the fact that more or less Latin America and the Caribbean constitutes a zone of peace, and that the dominant approach to conflict management and containment is by diplomacy. And it should also be noted that countries within CELAC, in an initiative that was led by Peru and Argentina, have coordinated their consular work in evacuating any citizens of CELAC countries who want to be evacuated. They have worked together to get their citizens, our citizens, out of Ukraine. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah. Now, this is where we start speaking about the interests and maybe the implications for territories and countries in the Caribbean. And I wanted to start with the European territories in the Caribbean. I'm not going to say much about those territories because you know the context better than I do, but I was thinking that in the discussion, you might want to develop your own scenarios a bit more. So in the Caribbean, there are British, French, and Dutch territories, all of which will be affected by the extended impacts of the war in Ukraine. European countries, members of NATO, will be more absorbed for a while by the new security and economic challenges coming from the near abroad, from Eastern Europe, from Ukraine, and possibly more distracted vis-a-vis governance in their more distant overseas territories. European Caribbean territories will obviously experience the economic consequences of the conflict, particularly in the cost of living, inflation rates, and the impact on productive sectors like tourism, just as is happening in the rest of the Caribbean. So I'm sure you might want to address those issues a little bit more as we continue. Can I go to the next slide, please? Now, the implication for other parts of the Caribbean. Most Caribbean countries are small countries. Small states tend to place particular value on multilateralism, multilateral norms of territorial integrity, self-determination and sovereignty, and all those things that CARICOM spelled out in its declaration. Peaceful settlement of disputes, respect for human rights and humanitarian principles. And in their view, they want to protect a world order that is based on such principles. Now, many Caribbean states are concerned that Russia's actions might encourage other actors, including in our immediate environs, to forcibly seize land or sea territory, or to encourage acts of separatism. In fact, this is why the declaration by CELAC was very much welcomed. The emphasis that Latin America and the Caribbean is a zone of peace and an area where territorial or other disputes are settled peacefully. This is, of course, very important for a country like Guyana, which has some very serious territorial challenges and which would like to settle those legally and diplomatically. From the humanitarian perspective, I think that Caribbean actors can identify with what is happening in Europe. Russia's invasion has unleashed a very damaging and very tragic new avalanche of human beings, distressed human beings, forced from their homes and forced from their country. Caribbean and Latin American actors are still absorbing an exodus of 5.6 million Venezuelan migrants and are fully aware of the destabilizing effects of such movements. They are sympathetic and they feel solidarity towards the dispossessed population of Ukraine and for those who are seeking to provide for them. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah. There are also concerns for us in the Caribbean about the post-conflict global environment. There is a strong risk that the global environment will become more restrictive and more ideologically polarized, which would not really help us in the Caribbean. There may be less flexibility to be non-aligned and neutral. Caribbean actors place value on a more open international space that enables multiple coalitions and alliances in order to advance different projects of climate change and disaster risk management, economic projects, etc. But there is the risk that this conflict will also cement even further the practice of imposing international sanctions. Sanctions usually last much longer than the conflicts which initiated them, and they are very restrictive on normal social and economic exchanges, and they have implications for all actors in the global space. Perhaps it is in the conflict in Ukraine. Sanctions are the most effective way of restraining Russian aggression. But these sanctions will be particularly restrictive in the medium to long term for international financial and economic activity of many types. So let us turn now from the political and the normative aspects for our countries to consider the economic implications for the Caribbean. I think that many people's minds have been focused on those economic implications because the outlook is grim, certainly for 2022 and beyond. It's important to consider the structure and the nature of most Caribbean economies. The majority are service-oriented with a strong dependence on tourism, migration remittances, financial services, and there is also the sector of economic citizenship. But there are also major commodity producers. There are exporters of oil and gas, bauxite and alumina, and agricultural products. The Caribbean is emerging from a very traumatic economic lockdown during the pandemic. In 2020, we had negative growth of minus 7.6%. And this would have been much worse without the Guyanese impact, without the fact that Guyana has these newfound oil resources. Without that, the CARICOM countries would have had an overall economic loss of at least minus 12%. In 2021, economies began to recover gradually, and there was in fact growth of 5%, according to ECLAC's report for 2021. Now, before the disaster in Ukraine, the IMF World Economic Outlook for 2022 had growth projections of 3.9%, call it 4%, for our economies that are tourism dependent, and 21% for the commodity exporters, largely Guyana, but also Suriname and Trinidad. At the same time, it was cautioned that there would be high inflation and a high cost of living. Now, most of those projections have to be revised. What we do know is that the cost of oil, the cost of a barrel, may go as high as $200, which will be dramatic and catastrophic for most economies. The Russian war will cause major economic disruptions due to energy scarcities, very high energy costs, rising costs of food, given the fact that Ukraine is a major food producer of grains, oil, also a major producer of fertilizer and other manufactured products. So is Russia. Air and sea transportation, which are going to rise because, of course, fuel rises, they rise too. And there will be major disruptions for tourism economies based on the impact on their major tourism markets. Next slide, please. And here we need to look particularly at Cuba and the Dominican Republic, because they are the major recipients of tourists from Russia and Ukraine. For the Dominican Republic expected approximately 500,000 tourists from Russia and Ukraine in 2022. The projected revenue to be earned of about $400 million US. Most of those earnings are not going to happen. Cuba has had its own, well, Cuba has been living through a particularly difficult domestic period, economic period. One, because of all the new sanctions that were imposed during the Trump administration, and also because they took the decision last year to finally unify their currency and not have two currencies, but have one currency, which has led to ever rising inflation, which is leading to hyperinflation, stagflation in Cuba. Now, it's important to clarify Cuba's position, a very uncomfortable position in the conflict, because Cuba is, of course, quite dependent on Russia as an economic partner. Nonetheless, on March 7th, President Diaz-Canel put out a statement that Cuba is unambiguously opposed to the use of force. And he advocated for constructive diplomatic solutions, which would guarantee security and sovereignty for all parties. Cuba has also made mention of Russia's security concerns and has argued that these were not addressed early enough or adequately by either NATO or the European Union. So Russia has been the largest source of tourists to Cuba, save for Canada, which is also very significant. And in 2020, Cuba received over 74,000 Russian visitors. In 2021, over 146,000 visitors from Russia. Now, like the Dominican Republic, that is unlikely to happen for a long time, as there is no way to fly for Russians to fly to Cuba from Russia. And of course, there's an economic embargo on Russian economic financial activities. Cuba also recently received the postponement of its debt payments to Russia until 2027. That happened last year, but this decision was only ratified in February of this year. It involves $2.3 billion US, which is debt contracted between 2006 and 2019 for a variety of infrastructural and energy investments. Now, both countries, both Cuba and the Dominican Republic, will have major supply chain disruptions from Ukraine and Russia, and major cost increases for food, energy, and other staples. And for them both, economic sanctions on Russia will be a long-term and very major challenge. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. Jamaica has specific vulnerabilities also because of Russian investment in its bauxite sector. The largest bauxite firm now, Windalco, is owned and operated by UC Rusal, a Russian company. Of course, there is no way at present for that company to finance its investment. Jamaica's trade in bauxite in 2020 with Russia was $68 million US. And for 2021, 3/4 of the year, 45 million. The final processing takes place in Russia. The ore and the alumina shipped to Siberia. So it's not clear what is going to happen, but the Jamaican government has taken temporary control of the company to pay its staff, but there has been no further news on this. Jamaica had about 40 to 50 medical students in Ukraine, but all were successfully evacuated after the Russian invasion. Could I have the next slide? Yeah, there are a number of fossil fuel producers in the Caribbean. Some of them are expected to benefit somewhat from the rising oil and gas prices. Now, even before the Russian invasion, oil and gas were expected to go up by 34–37% in 2022. The projections are now much higher, dizzyingly high, especially for petroleum prices. Some of the analysts project that Guyana will be the country, the economy which benefits most from rising oil prices in 2022. It will have increased royalties and export earnings. But it's not all hunky-dory for Guyana, as they only export crude. Guyanese consumers will suffer from the higher costs of petroleum products and, of course, from high inflation. This has generated discussions about developing their refining capacity. They're a very new oil producer. The projections for Suriname are said to be neutral at this point. And the projections for Trinidad are also neutral, because Trinidad's production of oil and gas is much reduced in recent years. In 2014, Trinidad came to an agreement with Venezuela, 2014 to 2017, to jointly invest in and exploit Venezuela's huge gas reserves. But this agreement was suspended in 2019 because of United States economic sanctions on Venezuela. So this has set back Trinidad's ability to even benefit domestically from these gas reserves, and it is certainly not in a position to benefit much from changes in the energy markets. A door has been half opened or quarter opened between Venezuela and the United States. There are ongoing talks between the two countries about lifting sanctions in order to facilitate Venezuela's increased production and exports of its oil and gas products. This may be positive, but the scenario is still very unclear. There are major issues and challenges in the relations between those two countries. Now, what about the economic vulnerabilities for the financial sector in the Caribbean? The entire financial sector, the entire banking sector throughout the region is likely to experience surveillance and more delays in transactions for consumers. I mean, small delays as well, annoying delays for people who are remitting their salary to their families, for people who live in one country and work in another country and have to remit for expenses. These are really quite difficult because of the intense regulation of our banking sector, and this will increase. There may be specific vulnerabilities for offshore financial sectors. One of the things that is being observed and monitored at the moment closely is the movement of Russian financiers' attempts to protect some of their assets within the European Union. The European Union has imposed stiff sanctions and is regulating more tightly its citizenship and residence programs. There are reports already that, well, it is known, number one, that there are large numbers of Russian nationals who have citizenship or residency in European Union countries, as well as in the United Kingdom. And some trackers have been tracking changes in ownership of shares in companies that are owned or partly owned by very wealthy Russian investors. It is in reading this that I found out that TUI, one of our major budget airlines that comes to the Caribbean, is largely Russian owned. I was not even aware of that. So some company shares have been migrating from European territories, from European bases particularly to the British Virgin Islands, at least according to these reports. But of course, one can't verify the accuracy of all these reports. That's the next slide. CARICOM unanimously condemned Russian actions, but left its member states to take unilateral actions. Many member states have indicated that they are not going to impose sanctions on Russian individuals with assets in their countries. But it doesn't really matter whether we sanction them or not. Once the United States has imposed sanctions and the European Union has imposed sanctions, it is going to affect anything that any kind of movement of funds through our economies. However, it is reported that some actions have been taken by countries that have citizenship by investment programs to preserve the credibility of their programs. Both Dominica and Antigua have announced changes in their policies, in the way they screen individual applicants in order to preserve the credibility of their programs. St. Lucia announced that its banking system would no longer allow fund transfers from Russia, while Antigua announced the suspension of citizenship applications from Belarus and Russia. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. So all these slides give you snapshots of economic disruptions, losses to productive sectors, and additional challenges for Caribbean territories in 2022 and beyond as a result of the Russian war on Ukraine. Haiti will be particularly challenged in terms of food security and very high energy costs. CARICOM's response, particularly through its current chair, Belize, supported by Barbados, has been to emphasize the need for tighter unity and solidarity. And at their recent intercessional meeting, which was held in Belize, they agreed to give priority to increasing food self-sufficiency and to seek funding for regional economic recovery. Food production will be led by Belize, Guyana, and Jamaica. CARICOM's food import bill is currently $5 billion, $5 American. There is one regional bank which has already pledged $100 million in investment funding for agricultural projects. But we hope this is just the beginning and that many other private sector companies will come on board with financing. There is supposed to be an agricultural conference in May on how to orient regional integration towards an agriculture-driven integration. So this is where I'm going to stop. I think we can go to the questions and the discussion. And I leave you with one slide showing the terrible destruction of cities and residences and Ukraine's infrastructure, which will mean that they have to rebuild from scratch. And on the other hand, our Caribbean and what we can do to help ourselves by cooperation and by focusing on resilience and greater self-sufficiency. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Jessica, sur notamment la partie caribéenne qui était assez précise. C'est ce qui était attendu principalement. Alors, on va commencer par des questions d'étudiants, notamment des questions générales. Et les questions générales, des étudiants se posent des questions sur la guerre en elle-même, sur ses aspects généraux. Donc, on va commencer avec les étudiants de Master 1. Et après, on passera à des questions plus locales, plus proches de nos préoccupations. Donc, il y a un petit groupe autour d'Océane, de Théo et de Rine qui ont préparé des questions. Je leur passe la parole donc pour trois premières questions générales sur la crise en Ukraine. Donc, Océane, Dorine et Théo, vous avez la parole.
Oui, bonsoir madame. Du coup, par rapport aux questions sur le conflit même, on a trois premières questions. La première, ce serait, est-ce que la guerre en Ukraine ne serait-elle pas une conséquence visible de la guerre froide? Déjà, tout simplement. Pour la deuxième question, on aurait une question sur les réels enjeux de cette guerre et notamment sur les conséquences pour la Caraïbe si le conflit s'enlise.
Could I hear that again, please?
Oui, pas de souci. La deuxième question, la deuxième et troisième question, ce serait quels sont les réels enjeux de cette guerre et notamment quelles seraient les conséquences pour la Caraïbe si le conflit s'enlise?
Si le
conflit perdure. Oui, si le conflit perdure.
If the conflict still going on.
Wait. Wait. Okay. If the conflict does not end quickly, is that it?
Oui, c'est ça.
La dernière question qu'on aurait éventuellement, mais c'est pas forcément la plus importante, mais que sait-on finalement de l'opinion publique russe sur cette guerre?
Ok.
No, could répéter s'il vous plaît, Océane?
Pas de souci. Que sait-on de l'opinion publique russe sur cette guerre?
Public opinion.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Thank you. Russian public opinion. Not that we know much of it. Okay. Is the war a consequence of the Cold War? I would disagree. I think the war is. On the one hand, the consequence of what goes on in Monsieur Putin's head, and the fact that he has a tremendous amount of power in his country, but it must be pointed out, although he has used this narrative of the fact that Russia and Ukraine and Belarus were always one country going back to the 9th century, and that Ukraine is not even a country, which is nonsense. There has always been this Russian sensitivity to any attempt to distance those two territories. There has been historical closeness and history, a very, very long history among these three countries. And the ironic thing is that perhaps President Putin has destroyed that forever, but we do not know. We don't know what the future will bring. I think it can be said that the war, well, some of the immediate discontents expressed by Russia's leadership relate to firstly, the agreements of spheres of influence that existed during the Cold War, and the fact that the areas around Russia, the areas that made up the Warsaw Pact, that made up the economic, the Comecon area, were regarded by the Soviet Union as necessary for its own security, necessary in order to have a self-sufficient ideological and political and security zone that was different from the Western capitalist world, and you had the communist world. And you had very difficult negotiations in the late 1980s, early 1990s, when all of this crumbled, when countries of Eastern Europe wanted to go their own way and were able to do so, not just walk out, but to do so through extensive negotiations between Soviet Union, or what was left of it, Russia, United Kingdom, the United States, and there was a fourth country as a part of that negotiation. And there were agreements as to what was necessary for Russia to feel secure. It was extremely delicate, and these were quite intense negotiations in order to allow a number of countries in the former Eastern Bloc to attain their own sovereignty. Many of those countries eventually became members of the European Union and members of NATO. But as you can see in most of Putin's discussions, he sort of drew a red line as to which countries should never join NATO and should never become members of the European Union. And that red line is probably based partly on the discussions, not by Putin, but by Putin's predecessors at the time when the Soviet Union was imploding, it's coming to an end. In the late 1980s, 1988, 1989, 1990. You probably need to go back and read the history of that period. It's quite interesting. So I would say that the war is partly a consequence of Russia's perceptions, Russia's leadership's perceptions of what was agreed then, their dissatisfaction as to where Russia is today in the world, and their feeling that Russia has never been fully accepted into the world that has been built, the globalized system that has been built since then. I remember years ago, there was a time when Russia was invited to join the meetings of the G7. And you heard that there were, oh, this is the G7.5. No, sorry, it was G7.5 and it was G8. For a while, they spoke about the G8. They spoke about Russia. Russia attended some meetings, but then relations went downhill. There was always a lot of distrust, and Russia ceased to attend such meetings at a particular point. And obviously, there are some forces in Russia that are dissatisfied. Russia's government has also become increasingly authoritarian. There is quite a lot of repression of democratic forces in Russia. And it is as much a consequence of what goes on within Russia as of what the evolution over the years. So I don't think it's a well, I mean, it is a legacy of the European world and the bipolar period, but it's not directly a consequence of the Cold War. I think that if the war lasts for a long time, the most terrible consequences are really going to be for the people of Ukraine. And of course, there will be major challenges for the countries that are hosting very large numbers of refugees from Ukraine. And usually you're remaining in a foreign country under circumstances such as this. go on for much longer than you had anticipated. And you become a part of the country that is your host country. And that country, your destiny and that country's destiny become interwoven. So Europe is going to change as a result of this event in ways that we cannot fully discern or anticipate at this point. But I think that Europe is going to be profoundly reshaped by the migratory forces that have influenced it over the last few years. Not only Ukrainian migrants, but in the other migrants that have come into Europe over the last few years. And there will be many positive effects as well as many challenges, in my view, my humble opinion. It is hard to say much about Russian public opinion because, as you know, there have been major efforts to stifle both Russian public opinion and expressions of their views. We know some of what, I think I know as much as you, because we know what we have seen on open media. And one of the things that we do know, one of the things that we have noticed is a steady stream of Russians leaving their country, many through Finland and many also through other points. And I don't think those people are leaving because they are very happy about what is happening. They are leaving because they disagree and because they are fearful about what's going to happen in their own country. But that is as much as we know at this point.
Très bien. Merci, Jessica. Merci, Jessica. Yeah. On va passer maintenant à un deuxième groupe autour de Camille, John et Peggy qui ont préparé des questions également. Donc, je sais qu'il y a une question de Camille. Je crois qu'elle est présente dans le Zoom. Et il y a John qui avait plusieurs questions. Il me semble que Peggy également, s'il est là. Est-ce que vous pouvez poser 3 questions sur la Caraïbe, sur les effets sur la Caraïbe? Donc, Camille, c'était une question sur la Caraïbe, je crois. Elle n'est pas là. Bon, si Camille n'est pas là, on va passer à John alors. John, oui, le micro est fermé, John. Il y avait des questions, me semble-t-il, de John sur la Caraïbe.
Je suis là, sinon je vais. Si John est occupé.
Camille est là, Camille est là.
Ah, Camille est là, très bien. Mais Camille, on vous écoute, Camille.
Oui, bonsoir. Je voulais demander à Mme Byron. Well, I'm going to try to ask my question in English. So,
Yeah.
I would ask if you think that this war could be a kind of opportunity for, well, when I say opportunity, is a way to say it, but for a regional integration organizations of the Caribbean to develop more partnership and more to develop their links. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Merci, Camille. Well, I think you would notice that towards the end of my talk, I referred to CARICOM's recent pronouncements about focusing on food security. And I am very happy, I personally am very happy to hear CARICOM speaking about putting more focus on agriculture. Although I'll believe it when I see it, because, you know, for years we have been speaking about Guyana being the breadbasket of the Caribbean, but it's not materialized as it should have done. And its agriculture in Guyana faces a difficult future because of this sudden huge focus on oil and gas. It's very likely, unless they make a great effort, agriculture is going to suffer from the Dutch disease. But I know that even while agriculture was ignored for many years in CARICOM in terms of major regional trade, that half of the OECS countries always lived from what was grown in the other half. St. Vincent and Dominica in particular, their farmers and their higglers, the traders, have supplied the agricultural markets in the Northern Caribbean, in Antigua, in St. Kitts and Nevis, in St. Martin, in Tortola, for many years. And it would be very, very good to see major investment flowing into that sector to be able to increase that trade. So yes, there are opportunities for greater self-sufficiency and for developing and for greater regional cooperation. And let's just do whatever we can individually and collectively and say a prayer that it really happens. Because we tend to come together in crises and then we forget when the crisis is over.
Ok, merci. Est-ce que John est là? Est-ce qu'il a des questions? Je vois qu'il est là, mais apparemment, il a du mal à poser ses questions. John? Non? John Altus? Bon. Alors, si John ne peut pas poser ses questions, on va peut-être passer aux questions d'internautes, Julien et James. Est-ce que vous avez des questions d'internautes à transmettre?
Alors, du côté de YouTube, pas de questions pour le moment. Tout le monde regarde attentivement le déroulé de cette conférence.
Très bien. Julien, pas de questions?
Non, pour l'instant, pas de questions.
OK. Peut-être l'anglais, peut-être.
C'est peut-être l'anglais, oui.
Oh, c'est tellement. Alors, on va sur Zoom maintenant. S'il y a des questions dans le groupe Zoom, il y a plusieurs personnes du CAGI, il y a des étudiants, il y a des personnalités politiques. J'ai vu monsieur Bangou qui est là. J'ai vu d'autres personnes. Est-ce qu'il y a des questions dans le Zoom? Alors, bien sûr, vous pouvez vous exprimer en français. Mme Byron comprend le français. Elle répondra en français ou en anglais comme elle le souhaite. Axel a une question. Axel André. Donc, il faut enlever votre... Voilà, Axel André. Allez-y, Axel.
Oui, bonsoir à tous. Donc, moi, j'aurais souhaité savoir, enfin, qu'on puisse en discuter, de la même manière que la crise de Covid aurait permis d'organiser le numérique, est-ce que la guerre en Ukraine serait de nature à favoriser de façon un peu plus précipitée et d'organiser la coopération de manière favorable dans la Caraïbe? C'est-à-dire que finalement, les États s'organisent entre eux et que cette guerre serait une sorte de catalyseur.
Alors, c'est un peu la question de Camille. Hein. Est-ce que la guerre peut servir de catalyseur, de moteur, en fait, paradoxalement, à une meilleure coopération entre les pays? C'est bien ça, Axel?
Voilà, c'est ça. Mais vraiment, ouais, c'est ça.
C'est ça.
Alors, la coopération dans la société civile et dans les entreprises, quelle sorte de coopération? Est-ce que...
je pense à la coopération, enfin, les échanges sur tout ce qui peut être alimentaire, pas les produits manufacturés, Mais les produits de première
Oui.
nécessité, c'est-à-dire par exemple les échanges qui concernent le pétrole, qui concernent l'agriculture, l'alimentation avec l'Amérique du Sud, avec le pétrole avec Trinidad and Tobago, enfin voilà.
Bon, ce type, mais ça, c'est plutôt les échanges commerciaux, non? Et les échanges commerciaux sont construits sur la base
Oui, c'est ça.
des accords commerciaux et entre les gouvernements. Et après, c'est le secteur privé, ce sont les entreprises qui, qui utilisent ces provisions législatives, ces provisions fiscales, etc., pour faire ces échanges. Bon, il y a les accords qui existent déjà et quelquefois les provisions ne sont pas tellement utiles, mais il faut commencer avec ce qui est là. Et si vous avez une entreprise, il faut étudier les provisions très soigneusement pour voir. Il faut peut-être parler avec les importateurs ou pour savoir comment entrer dans tel ou tel marché et qu'est-ce qu'il faut faire. Il faut avoir un distributeur, etc. Peut-être l'environnement est plus favorable pour les échanges dans la musique ou les échanges culturels ou les choses comme ça pour ce type de coopération.
La question est de savoir si la guerre va précipiter, va renforcer cette coopération.
Bon, à cause des difficultés économiques.
Oui, c'est ça.
Qui peut-être, je ne sais pas. Je crois que peut-être la guerre va précipiter quelques types d'investissements. Si on peut remplacer, par exemple, moi je crois que la guerre et les prix énergétiques vont encourager nos efforts pour avoir plus d'énergie renouvelable. Ça, je crois, que les prix de l'énergie va renforcer les efforts du gouvernement barbadien ou du gouvernement de la Dominique de continuer ce qu'ils ont commencé avec l'énergie géothermale pour la Dominique et pour la Barbade, le solaire. Ça peut aussi encourager des échanges d'expertise entre nos territoires, entre les gens qui possèdent déjà l'expérience de quelques technologies, quelques expertises dans les énergies renouvelables, quelques autres qui veulent développer. Les choses comme ça. Et peut-être quelques techniques. Si maintenant il y a une curiosité pour développer l'agriculture, peut-être ceux qui ont de l'expertise de certaines techniques peuvent propager les choses comme ça.
Très bien. Merci, Jessica. Alors, il y a deux questions. Maintenant, Thierry, et ensuite, M. Bango. Donc, Thierry, on commence avec toi, Thierry Tassius, et après Jacques Bango. Thierry,
oui, bonsoir à tous.
Oui.
Merci au CAGI, au Co.Re.Ca également pour l'organisation. de cette conférence. Merci également à Jessica BYRON pour sa présentation. Alors, ma question, moi, concerne plus l'information. C'est-à-dire à l'heure actuelle où l'information, il me semble, est une ressource importante dans les relations internationales et dans la géopolitique en général. Ma question serait la suivante. Quels sont les réseaux ou canaux d'information dont la CARICOM, la CELAC ou d'autres organisations caribéennes se servent pour pouvoir justement s'informer sur ce qui se passe en Ukraine, précisément en ce moment. C'est-à-dire, et quand je demande quels sont ces réseaux d'information, je me pose la question de leur éventuel peut-être assujettissement à d'autres réseaux ou éventuellement de leur indépendance ou autonomie par rapport à d'autres réseaux d'information. Donc, ma question concerne vraiment les réseaux d'information disponibles pour les États caribéens. Merci.
Okay, good question. Well, first of all, it depends on, you asked about CELAC, you asked about CARICOM. So I'll talk about those two. I think, first of all, speaking about the countries are going to rely on their diplomatic offices, on their embassies, and the information they get from those embassies. If you take the CARICOM countries, looking at the Guerre, looking at the war in Ukraine, Russia, Jamaica has an embassy in Russia, in Moscow. I have friends who were based there. So I don't know if that embassy is still open. I think it would be because of the investments from Russia in the Jamaican bauxite sector. So I suspect it is. They also have an embassy in Germany. Trinidad also has, so you've got countries in CARICOM that have embassies in the area. That would be one source of information. Most of the Latin Americans have embassies. They're Latin American, they're members of CELAC, have embassies in Russia, in Ukraine, in Lithuania, the Baltic states, and so on. There are lots of embassies there. In terms of news media, so that's the first, those would be the first sources of information at the government level, right? They would also get information from friendly countries. They would get briefings. They would get briefings from Canada, they'd get briefings from NATO countries, Canada, United States, Britain, EU people. There's also, for the average person, Al Jazeera is very much consulted for news media. In addition to what's the one called? South, there is the Telesur. Is very much consulted. If you read French and Spanish, Portuguese maybe, as well as English, I mean, you have so many newspapers, you have so much press, so much media that you can consult that carries very good information. Today I was trying to find the CELAC positions. So CELAC is presently chaired by Argentina. So I went to the Argentinian press, first of all, because I knew that there I would find reports on what CELAC is saying, what CELAC is doing, what countries in CELAC are doing. Because with CELAC, the presidency goes from one country to another. The secretariat moves from country to country each year. So you have to know which country is in charge, and because the main information is going to come from that country's sources of information. But I think that there's a variety of news media. It is always good to watch Chinese television as well. China, I think, decided not to comment on much of what has been happening. But it is generally good to get a balanced view. And these days, most of the world's media is at our fingertips. But it's good not to limit yourself to one language, I think. I wanted to just say one more thing about the previous question, the cooperation question.
Okay.
Cooperation in the Caribbean will never thrive if we don't have good transportation among trees. We cannot trade and we cannot visit each other except virtually if we don't have regular, reliable, and convenient and cost-effective air and sea transport. Similarly, we need to at least reflect in our media what is happening in other Caribbean countries. And I think that we have gone backwards in that respect in recent years. We are less aware of what is happening in other countries. I must tell you that I look regularly at France, and I must tell you that the part of France Guyane is the version of the newspaper that has the most information on countries that surround the territory of Guyane Francais. So sometimes when I want to know what is happening in South America, I go and I read France Guyane for information. Okay? But I cannot hear you.
Question de Jacques Mangou.
Oui, bonsoir. Merci au CAGI. Et je salue également Jessica BYRON et je la remercie pour la clarification qu'elle nous apporte, en tout cas les éléments sur la Caraïbe. Alors moi, il y a un acteur international qui n'est pas paru du tout dans son exposé, c'est la Chine. Et donc, je voudrais savoir ce qu'elle pense de l'avenir possible des relations entre les différents pays de la Caraïbe, de notre bassin, avec la Chine. Est-ce qu'il y aura plus de réticence? Est-ce qu'il y aura au contraire des rapprochements? Est-ce qu'il y aura une volonté de la Chine expansionniste vis-à-vis de la Caraïbe? Est-ce que, on a vu Cuba et la République de Saint-Domingue qui sont impactés au niveau économique les premiers par la disparition de la Russie dans leur sphère économique. Est-ce qu'il y aura là des places à prendre par la Chine? Qu'est-ce qu'elle en pense? Ou est-ce que la Chine n'est pas du tout impliquée dans le secteur, ce que je ne crois pas?
No, I didn't. Well, I did not mention China because, well, the conflict. I could have mentioned China largely to say that China has been very reticent about its position. I referred obliquely to China when I mentioned the BRICS. China has been reticent, I think, for a number of reasons. One is, of course, its concern with Taiwan and not wanting to make any pronouncement that would contradict its concerns and its position that Taiwan is an integral part of China, of the People's Republic of China. The impression I have, which has only now been, you would have seen that President Xi met with President Biden a few days ago, and he made quite an extensive statement saying that this is not a useful war. It's not a useful war. It is not a war that is being pursued for useful reasons, and that a war should have a useful purpose, which I hope I interpreted him correctly, which was interesting because up until that time, China had more or less indicated that it preferred to remain neutral. And China had also stated quite emphatically that it does not agree with sanctions, that it is against the imposition of sanctions. And that is quite understandable because China has itself been the target of, during the Trump administration, extensive economic trade sanctions from the United States. China could engage more in terms of putting pressure on Russia to, I'm not sure that it would help, but China obviously could engage more with Russia and has the ability to either facilitate Russia financially and militarily or not. I think the Chinese are going to do what they consider to be best for China in this. I don't think they feel they have to be nice to the West. They are going to, their choices will be based on what they see as being in the interests of China and of China's future position in the world. With regard to China in the Caribbean and in Latin America, China is already a very major actor in this part of the world. And all of us know it and accept it, except the United States. The United States knows it, but does not accept it. But China, it has been a partner of a number of countries and is a major economic actor, is a major investor, has supplied much of the infrastructure, the hard, the physical infrastructure in many countries. And there are large numbers of Chinese citizens living and working, running businesses across the Caribbean and across Latin America. Also, we must remember, China didn't just come from somewhere in the 80s. We have Chinese Caribbean people who have been here certainly since the middle of the 1800s. The Panama Canal was built by Caribbean people and Chinese people. So we have Chinese who are Caribbean people who have roots in China still. So I don't think that China is a stranger to the Caribbean. We maybe have not sought to learn enough about China, but there's a lot to be learned. China has Confucian centers at all 3 campuses of my university. We have Chinese staff. Each university chooses what, in addition to the cultural activities, what it is we want to do, the country and the university there wants to do with China. In the case of Trinidad, there has been a lot of focus on agricultural science research, as well as on the cultural development and the language development. So I don't think China is a new phenomenon in the Caribbean, Mr. Bangu, and I think that the relationship with China is going to continue to develop.
Merci, Jessica. On va passer à la question de Nicolas Parvin. Ensuite, on passera à la question, la parole à James pour 2 questions des internautes, en tout cas des internautes connus qui sont du CAGI, je crois. Non, un journaliste, Marc Laviolette et Lisette Farial. Donc, Nicolas, vous avez la parole.
Okay, so I would like to thank Jessica BYRON for this beautiful presentation. I would just ask a question about the Caribbean countries. You said that Cuba trade complex parks because of the change of situation, and they have lost millions or many tourists from Russia. And I would like to know if you think that this context will further the relation between Cuba and United States, because we know that the geopolitical map of this region have quite changed being between this during this conflict. And for example, Venezuela are on ongoing talk with United States. So what do you think about the change with Cuba and maybe other countries of the Caribbean region?
Yes, Nicolas.
Well, okay. Well, first of all, Nicolas, Cuba has very good relations with most countries in this region. And Cuba, certainly the CARICOM countries have extremely good both institutional and socio-cultural relations with Cuba. Cuba's relationship with the United States is not based on the same foundations as Venezuela's relationship with the United States. For two reasons. There is historically, Cuba and the United States were extremely close, as you know, but also there have always been sovereignty problems from the very beginning of Cuba's independence. There have been tensions of sovereignty and hegemony in Cuba and the United States. But we need to recall that during the presidency of Barack Obama, for the first time since 1959, 1962, the United States dramatically tried to change its approach to Cuba. Obama said that the embargo and the isolation has not worked, has not brought about United States type democracy in Cuba in all those years. And he thinks it's time to try a different approach. And so between 2014 and 2016, we saw the beginnings of a rapprochement between the two countries, all of which was canceled, not by Cuba, but by the Trump administration when it came to power at the end of 2016. Things have not changed much with the Biden administration. Biden's administration for most of last year said that Cuba was not a priority, and they left all the sanctions in place, including even the barriers to remittances to Cuba. Even though they knew what was happening in Cuba, they knew that Cuba was under extreme pressure. And then when you had the demonstrations, which became quite extensive last year, August, but there was also some interference from outside. When they had those demonstrations, after that, I think about 33 congressmen made a special appeal to the government saying, you have to develop a Cuba policy. You have to do something in Cuba. You have to at least show that you have a policy towards Cuba. And there was a flurry of activity during the second half of last year. They announced that they set up a committee to look at how to increase the flow of remittances to Cuba. They set up a committee to study the internet in Cuba. They set up a committee. They set up about 4 committees to try and restart relations with Cuba and engage more with the Cubans. And then in November, they suspended all of that. Biden administration suspended all of that and said again, Cuba is not a priority for them. There are probably domestic political reasons in the United States for this. They have midterm congressional elections coming up. They are very, very much afraid of Florida. They are very anti-Cuba. The president, the governor of Florida is descended from Cuban migrants. He's very anti-Cuba. You have Marco Rubio, another one. You've got some very inflammatory Cuban voices in the Republican Party. And this administration doesn't want to do anything that will ensure a Republican victory next time around, and they do not want to lose seats in Congress in the midterm election, but they are going to lose seats in Congress. And then after that, there will be little that they can do because they will not be able to pass any legislation and to do anything and to do much of what could be done in Cuba. They have to have a legislative majority in the House. So this is where things are with Cuba. It's not a question about Cuba going to the United States. It's a question of where the United States is and where a lot of the United States is, or a good part of them. They would like to see the people die of hunger and probably overthrow the Cuban government and have another country in chaos. The thing is, there are many Cubans probably who are not satisfied or content with where their country is economically. Maybe many who are not satisfied with where it is politically. But Cubans like stability. Cubans look around and they see the chaos to which other countries have been reduced. Where all the institutions fall apart and nothing works and a country has 10 years of misery. They don't want to be in that position. They don't mind change, but they want orderly change. Yes. And that is why, so that is what I would say, at least from what I observe of the Cubans.
Thank you very much.
Alors, il y a, avant la conclusion par Julien Mérillon, les deux dernières questions qui vont en partie concerner encore Cuba, d'après ce que je vois, qui seront traduites par James. James a la parole. Deux questions, une de Marc Laviolette et l'autre de Lisette Faria.
Donc, je vais d'abord les donner en français et ensuite les donner en anglais. Donc, la première question de Marc Laviolette concernait encore une fois Cuba, mais aussi le Venezuela. Donc c'était ce conflit va-t-il davantage marginaliser Cuba et le Venezuela dans le concert caribéen? So would you say, Miss Byron, that the conflict is gonna further marginalize Cuba and Venezuela in the Caribbean landscape? And second question was about the political and ideological divides between the states of the Caribbean. Would this have an effect on this political divide between the states?
I'm not sure I understand that second one.
Yeah, the second question was about the war in the ways it could revive ideological divides between the states of the Caribbean, not only Cuba and Venezuela, maybe the other countries.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, let's go to the first one. Mm-hmm. Well, you would notice that in my presentation, I said that there is a danger that ideological polarization might be one of the negative effects of this war. That it might be that because we are in a context of a shifting global order, where the West feels challenged. They're challenged by China. They're challenged by a number of upcoming, not superpowers, but middle powers, emerging powers. Look at who is leading the negotiations with Russia. It's Turkey. It's not, it is a country that is part of a new array of active players globally that have nothing to do with the West, at least not in a positive sense. Right. So there is a danger for a lot of countries, or a danger that is seen, a negative aspect of this conflict is that many countries, most of us fear that the international atmosphere is going to become more serré, less flexible, more tight, and that countries are going to be pressured to line up once again as we used to have to do. And there are lots of countries who feel that there is a need to resuscitate some kind of non-aligned movement, because most countries in this world do not have an interest in being in a camp. They want to have more flexibility to develop their own positions, to make their own productive relations with whoever they feel like in this world, as long as the country is not, is not a terrible country. I'm afraid that Russia's image is going to be very badly damaged after this war in that respect. So definitely, the Caribbean is going to suffer the risk of being in a highly ideological, polarized environment because of where we are. If we are in a sphere of influence, it is in the sphere of influence of the United States and North America. We don't necessarily want to be, we want to have good relations with them, but we don't want to be told that we mustn't talk to China, and we mustn't have Huawei, and we mustn't do this and that. But I think that those pressures are going to become greater. That is probably one foreseeable consequence of this conflict. With regard to, was it Cuba and Venezuela? Or was that the question itself? The things are going to be...
The second one was about the divides between the states of the Caribbean.
Johnson.
Yeah.
Yeah. Divisions among the states of the Caribbean. Yeah. Ideological divisions?
Yeah, political and ideological, yeah.
Political divisions were, I think, stirred up a lot during the Trump administration in the United States. The Trump administration had a strange approach to Caribbean unity. In the first place, they decided that if they wanted, the Trump administration, they decided that Jamaica is the leader of the Caribbean. Probably because it was easier for them at that point to work with Jamaica. Jamaica's economy was heavily beholden to the IMF and the Inter-American Development Bank. Jamaica was trying its best to steer a middle line between China and the United States, both of whom are important actors for it. But every time the Trump administration wanted to get CARICOM to do something, they used to go and hold a meeting in Jamaica. Most of the time, Jamaica was not the chair of CARICOM at that time. And they would offend whoever was in the chair at CARICOM. By doing this, only a few countries would turn up. Haiti would always turn up. St. Lucia would turn up sometimes, and so on. And so they would claim to have a majority of voices. But in fact, it was a very poor diplomatic strategy in terms of dealing with the Caribbean. I think that with the disappearance of the Trump administration, some of those tensions have gone. We have also had a number of electoral changes in the Caribbean. During 2020, there were about 8 elections, and there were some major changes in Suriname, in Guyana, in Belize. And those electoral changes mean that you have governments that are going to take different initiatives and probably release new dynamics into regional politics. With regard to Cuba, I think Cuba was in there sometimes. Cuba has very good links with most Caribbean countries. These are links that have been built over 60, 70 years. There's an institutional network both at the multilateral level and also at the bilateral level. And Cuba has trained about 6,000 medical professionals in this region. I keep meeting not just medical professionals, engineers and so on. When I go to St. Vincent, when I go to St. Lucia, when I go to Antigua, I meet all these people who lived in Cuba, studied there, and Cuban families were very kind to them. These are people who are now in their 50s or so. They are leaders in their countries, and they retain those memories. So I don't think that it is easy to isolate Cuba within the Caribbean. Neither is it easy to isolate Venezuela, but Venezuela has to work through its internal political difficulties itself. The Caribbean position is that Venezuela must be left to sort out its politics. We will try to offer hospitality to some of the many Venezuelans who have left Venezuela and are sheltering in other countries. But Venezuela also has a very long history of interaction with Caribbean countries. The relationship differs. The only country that very unfortunately where the relationship with Venezuela has broken down at present is Jamaica. And I think that will change eventually. But that is the only Caribbean country really that has difficult relations with Venezuela.
Merci Jessica. On va passer à une dernière personne la parole, c'est John. Et après, on passe la parole à Julien pour la conclusion. Malheureusement, Océane, on a dépassé le temps de la conférence. Donc, je passe la parole à John qui avait préparé des questions, mais qui n'a pas pu les poser tout à l'heure. Donc, je passe la parole à John et après, Julien Mérillon pour la conclusion. John, Altius.
Bonsoir. Good evening, everyone. I have many questions, but I just want to ask one out of the many. This is a very interesting webinar. Given the widespread sanctions that are implemented against any country which chooses to honor or establish relations, agreements, like you mentioned, for comparative advantage by the Western states with Russia, would you consider that the sovereignty of other countries have been respected in that regard? I say this particularly, you mentioned Venezuela, and right now the US, from news I've been listening from Bloomberg, is now seeking to see whether or not they could get oil from Venezuela and Saudi Arabia. And you also have other countries who perhaps who choose not to side with the Western forces. You see sanctions on them. And I say this because just recently they had the FATCA agreement, which was passed by the United States. And that's one of, to me, it's a form of economic warfare. So I wanted to get your opinion. Yeah, FATCA, yes.
Well, what
You
you
know,
have to do, if you don't like FATCA, don't work in the US. Don't ever take a contract where you end up having to have a social security number and a bank account in the United States. If you have a bank account in the United States, you have to abide by FATCA.
right, and I agree with that.
Yes.
But the thing that's troubling about FATCA is that the institutions in the Caribbean have been left to bear the cost of finding out the information, whether or not they have these US citizens, and if they do not have the proper
No,
control
you don't
to
know.
detect
And not that you
them.
have to be a US citizen. If you have a bank account or you get payments from the United States,
Right. Then
you have to give
they have to pay the fines.
You have to give all your tax information to the United States.
And if these institutions...
Okay, right. Well, first of all, let's start with the question of sovereignty. Now, there is a famous US academic who said that the concept of sovereignty is organized hypocrisy. And I have always liked, I don't like much of what he writes, but I like the expression, because sovereignty is organized hypocrisy. Sovereignty is far more present in the abstract than it is in practical terms. Particularly, the international community is a highly hierarchical place. And many countries, all countries now, with globalization, all countries' sovereignty is subject to interdependence, economic interdependence, other type technological independence, and so on. So, I mean, we mustn't have illusions about sovereignty. We must continue to try to protect it and to condemn when it is grossly violated, as in the case of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But we must not be naive about sovereignty. And the smaller you are and the weaker you are, the more difficult it is to preserve this thing called sovereignty. That's the first thing. Mr. Altius, go back to what you were saying again. Now you were speaking about the United States.
Yes,
and, oh yes, you were speaking about sanctions.
Yes.
Now, but you're also speaking about two different things, because economic sanctions are a different creature from those regulations, those financial regulations. First of all, in terms of the United States and the Caribbean, since the 1990s, the United States has been gradually extending extraterritorial jurisdiction over the Caribbean in terms of extending its legal system to us in certain areas. Those areas include money laundering and the financial flows generally. They include piracy and the monitoring of our air and sea territorial spaces via the agreements that we have signed with the United States to allow US naval vessels to police our air and sea space. The two countries who tried to stand up, this was back in the 1990s, the two countries who tried to resist that, Barbados and Jamaica, both underwent severe pressure. US decided that Barbados's airport was unfit for US planes to land in, and so Barbados's tourism was affected for a while. And they imposed other types of pressure. The ship rider agreements. In the end, all of us have ship rider agreements. We have agreed to have the United States police our maritime, and airspace. We have legal agreements for the exchange, mutual, what is it called? For exchanging information, legal information, security information. We have extradition agreements with the United States. We have the money laundering laws that we have were drafted by the United States and adopted in all our countries. So since the 1990s, there is a whole barrage of legislation which has been mutually agreed on. I don't think we had much choice between the US government and the Caribbean. The Caribbean is referred to as the third border of the United States, and the United States feels that those legislative arrangements are necessary to preserve US security in terms of what we do and who we accept and how we deal with them in our countries. Okay, so that's what sovereignty looks like when you live in the Caribbean. Now, in terms of the sanctions, recently, not too long ago, I did a whole little course on sanctions. Sanctions are diabolical, in my view, but they're getting larger and larger. There's a huge administration in the United States that started when the United States imposed sanctions on Cuba in 1962, that embargo. It has become a highly profitable and very effective way of stopping anything that the United States does not like in the world. And you have all these sanctions. You have all this money frozen. Iran's money is frozen since 1979. They started releasing some of it the other day and then stopped. You have all these frozen resources from many, many countries. Once you trade in the US dollar, once you have reserves of your central bank there, it means that if at some point there is a disagreement, the United States decides to impose economic sanctions on your country, a lot of your assets are going to be frozen indefinitely in the United States. It might be called a form of highway robbery, but it is present, it is accepted. There are a small number of sanctions that are multilateral sanctions and are imposed by the United Nations, and there are lots of sanctions that are unilaterally imposed, largely by the United States, to some extent by the European Union. Many of those, they have equally damaging consequences, but they're imposed in a different way. But it is an effective way of pressuring most countries, not just the countries that they're imposed on, but other countries. There are third-party sanctions. If sanctions are imposed on Libya, Syria, Iran, Venezuela, if Trinidad makes an investment in Venezuela, Trinidad is also going to be sanctioned. Okay? And so that is a very effective way of controlling lots of different economic actors if you have enough economic clout, and ensuring that countries really become isolated. So this is how it works. And unfortunately, sanctions are becoming the economic weapon of choice. This is part of this new world order that we are going into. And it's becoming that way because this is one area of power where the United States and its allies retain significant weight. There are attempts to bypass it. You are gradually seeing Asian countries setting up their own economic systems. And one of the reasons why Venezuela was sanctioned increasingly by the United States, because Venezuela was trying to move its currency out of US dollars. I don't know how it was going to do that when US was its largest market for oil, but it was trying. And that became a major area of disagreement. So this is where we are with sanctions. It is a major battlefield in today's shifting power balance in the world.
Merci, professeur Byron. Merci à tous les intervenants pour les questions pertinentes et la qualité surtout des réponses. Je passe la parole à Julien Mérillon pour une conclusion générale sur cette manifestation particulièrement intéressante. Julien, tu as la parole pour une conclusion.
Je ne vais pas être particulièrement long puisque nous avons un peu excédé l'heure, mais l'intérêt du sujet et la qualité même de l'intervention de Jessica BYRON l'explique très largement. Alors, bien évidemment, nous allons remercier Jessica en tout premier lieu de sa disponibilité, de la qualité et du caractère pédagogique de la présentation qu'elle a faite. Remercier les étudiants qui ont joué le jeu encore une fois de plus par la pertinence de leurs questions, mais remercier les participants, les internautes. Alors, bien évidemment, le sujet est d'actualité, vous l'avez compris. Le sujet pose des problématiques qui sont aujourd'hui notre quotidien par les médias, notre quotidien par les effets que l'on commence à subir de cette crise. Et il était important pour le CAGI et le Co.Re.Ca d'ouvrir un peu ce champ du débat pour mieux comprendre la situation et aussi tenter peut-être d'anticiper ce que pourront être les prochaines semaines, voire les prochains mois. Donc, ce n'est peut-être qu'un début. Nous allons poursuivre la réflexion sur ces questions. Sur ce, encore une fois, merci à tout le monde et à bientôt sur nos rendez-vous habituels, c'est-à-dire le Facebook Live du Co.Re.Ca et la chaîne YouTube du CAGI.